This is a crazy update to the Cyberpunk 2077 situation, or really at this point, saga. A recent leak suggests that one of the big reasons for some of the big bugs that came with the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't actually CDPR's fault, and instead was another company lying and potentially even misleading CD Projekt Red. This most recent update all began on June 23rd at around 9 AM. Another YouTuber known as Upper Echelon Gamers claims to have received an email from a whistleblower at Quantic Lab. This email detailing some of the incredibly egregious practices that have been taken during the development of Cyberpunk 2077. And if you are interested in the original report, I will have a link to Upper Echelon Gamers video down below so you can check it out. But otherwise, Quantic Lab is functionally outsourced quality assurance. You hire them to test your game and report bugs back to you. They worked on Cyberpunk 2077, but also The Witcher 3 and many other games. They're actually a relatively large company. And here the whistleblower is exposing some of the questionable practices they saw during the development of Cyberpunk 2077 at Quantic Lab. This whistleblower is still under NDA, but provided Upper Echelon Gamers with a 72-page QA testing file, as well as several other documents like HR paperwork, workflow charts, and even production maps to attempt to verify their identity and prove they actually know what they're talking about when it comes to Quantic Lab and the testing phase of Cyberpunk 2077. Now, these documents haven't been revealed publicly, but honestly, that's not all surprising as they are confidential documents for an active company. This is where things get to the difficult part of this video. We are really just required to take Upper Echelon Gamers at face value of this being legit. Not to say that I think they are making up the whistleblower, but rather the legitimacy of the files and the whistleblower overall is completely up to Upper Echelon Gamers' subjective opinion, just as he states in his own video. But he does describe, after digging into this, he does believe the whistleblower is legit because the annotations on the document seem real compared to game missions, employee names, and dialogue, and the timeline also matches development roadmaps and claimed issues with the game. And overall, he's actually had a pretty good track record with this type of stuff and isn't just lazily reporting on it. The real here is what this whistleblower has to say about the quality assurance process of Cyberpunk 2077 at Quantic Lab. Reportedly, some of the major issues came in late 2019. The QA team meant to be dealing with Cyberpunk 2077 at Quantic Lab was sent to actually meet with CDPR directly. These were supposed to be a bunch of veteran team members, people who have a lot of experience with quality assurance. Instead, apparently there were a ton of juniors. The team largely consisting of employees who had under a year or even under 6 months of experience, and even the team leader only had about a year of experience in QA. And this being a team that is now supposed to bug test one of the most ambitious video games ever created. CDPR had expectations that a team similar to those who worked on The Witcher 3 would be here, a lot of veterans, but reportedly many of the veterans that worked on The Witcher 3 actually left Quantic Lab already. Although having an inexperienced team is one thing, reportedly one of the bigger issues was that Quantic Lab enacted a policy of bug quotas, as apparently 10 bugs per day were expected to be reported to CDPR while testing Cyberpunk 2077, which led many of these QA testers to functionally just start spamming CDPR devs with minor visual issues, rather than some of the more fundamental game problems as they were attempting to hit their daily quotas. And it's described how this turned into a massive list of minor bugs that required a ton of dev time to fix, but was also completely missing the core and fundamental problems with the game. Eventually, CDPR told Quantic Lab to stop focusing on small issues and instead on the bigger ones. But apparently the damage was already done now, as there was a lot of lost time, as well as a massive stockpile of minor bug reports to get through. From there, it was described how the team was expanded from 30 to 60 testers, but since Quantic Lab was short-staffed, these 30 new testers were completely inexperienced, and many had literally no prior experience in quality assurance. And some of these new team members didn't even get any training, which led to this really interesting situation where, despite the team expanding, productivity actually declined because the veteran members now had to teach the new members how to actually do their jobs. And one of the bigger claims from a legal perspective, the whistleblower also says that Quantic Lab made false claims about QA team sizes to secure contracts both in 2019 and 2020, basically saying that there would be more QA testers on a project than they actually had. And to protect all of this misconduct at this company, Quantic Lab had a very strict NDA where you can't even talk about what games you worked on, and there were $10,000 fines for breaking that. So this video from Upper Echelon Gamers did recently come out, and it has been making a big splash in the Cyberpunk 2077 community, with many fans of the game pointing out that this is proof that things were at least partially not CDPR's fault. And it does actually seem to heavily resemble something the CDPR co-founder said very early on, about a month after the release of the game.
Every change and improvement needed to be tested, and as it turned out, our testing did not show a big part of the issues you experienced while playing the game.
Now, at the time, this quote was heavily criticized. How do you not catch all of these very obvious and very major bugs in the game? But now, a couple of years later, getting a report on the major shortfalls of the primary QA testers may shed some light onto what actually happened, or it may not, as there is definitely some dissent here. Legacy Killer HD did report on Twitter how he spoke to several sources at CD Projekt Red who refuted the claim that bugs weren't caught because Quantic Lab lied to CDPR, continuing to say that one developer stated, "We knew about the bugs that people were complaining about. That was not something that was unknown to us. But we did not have time to focus on it. We were crunching like crazy, so we were paper thin at the end," describing how overall Quantic's quality assurance role was minimal, with much of the issues being on CDPR's own mismanagement. And overall, to me, this is an interesting situation where it does paint a picture where CDPR in many ways did have the cards stacked against them with the release and even immediately after the release of Cyberpunk. But at the same time, that's very clearly not the only issue, and in some ways it's kind of like, okay, so? Like, even if we just assume everything in this report is true, Quantic Lab was the worst quality assurance team to hire in history. The core issue is they released a broken game, and many of those problems were relatively front-facing, relatively obvious. CDPR's management are the people who still chose to release the game. They hired a bad QA team. I think many people would agree the way to fix that or to resolve that in the future would be to delay the game, hire a better team, and fix those issues, not just release the game anyway. One of the most famous quotes that is often pointed to is how Cyberpunk 2077 runs surprisingly well on the Xbox One and PS4. You've almost certainly heard that quote at some point in this whole controversial release. And of course, in reality, that was very far from true. There was a major crashing issue to begin with, which is kind of its own problem. But even further, there were a lot of FPS issues. You would get low 20 FPS or even under 20 FPS at points on those consoles, which is pretty rough. As someone who typically plays at 60 FPS on a PC or even above 60 FPS, I would consider that pretty unplayable. And the reason I bring up this specific issue is because it is incredibly obvious. Even if you have a quality assurance team that completely dropped the ball, it's never going to be subtle that driving to one part of Night City is going to plummet your FPS, or even the fact that playing the game too long on those consoles would lead to crashing. Those were very easy things to detect, and I have to imagine many people at CDPR were aware of them. And one of the most egregious parts about this overall is CDPR didn't really give out console review codes. So it's not even like we had a representative picture of how this game would play on consoles before release. And even the initial reviews on PC, you weren't allowed to actually use gameplay footage. Those two things are typically massive red flags when it comes to an upcoming game. But to circle back around, I do still feel like this is a pretty interesting and difficult situation for CDPR. I think the blame is completely on them. They could have chosen to delay the game even further, and they probably at this point almost wish they did. But at the same time, CDPR definitely had some major cards stacked against them. Having a core of your quality assurance testers being completely inexperienced or even not reporting some of the biggest bugs is a massive blow development-wise. But even further, we have to remember that CDPR was hacked just a couple of months after the release of Cyberpunk, which is another major blow to development and at that point fixing the game. And looking at the situation overall, I think it's more of one where CDPR made some very big mistakes. They made some very poor decisions that directly hurt consumers. But at the same time, there were also situations that directly hurt CDPR development-wise and made releasing a bug-free experience much more difficult for them. To me, it seems like both of those things are true. And principally, I think this new whistleblower adds a lot of context to one of the things that may have gone wrong, but it's not the thing that caused the issues with Cyberpunk. As even just from my personal experience, getting a review code for the game about 12 hours before it was publicly released, so not nearly enough time to really have any kind of meaningful review, and even further, experiencing finding many bugs in the first few minutes of the game. A lot of these being super minor and honestly funny or silly things, but obvious and glaring bugs right off the bat. These weren't subtle issues, and I was playing on a high-end gaming PC. That's supposed to be the ideal experience for this game. With that said though, I think this adds a lot of context to the situation overall, and it's just another interesting data point as to what went wrong with Cyberpunk, but I think there's a lot of data points in the mix. Unfortunately, things have come a very long way since then. We've gotten a ton of updates. We have another big update on the way. There's actually been some recent movement on the testing branches. We don't know exactly when this will be coming out, but 1.6 might be the last major update Cyberpunk gets before the big expansion comes out, and even before that, modders are doing some pretty insane stuff with this game. As of late, we have been getting some really crazy mods, and if you want to pick up Cyberpunk for yourself, you can use my affiliate link, so I'll get a bit of a kickback if you buy it off of GOG. It is currently 50% off there, or separately, you can get it on Steam, also 50% off. With that said, thank you guys all for watching. I hope you found this one informative. Hopefully we'll have some more mod and news content around Cyberpunk as we move past some of these initial issues with the game going forward. But as always, again, I thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.